Did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to Hounds of Asher.
Hey everybody, it's me, Steve Asher, your host of House of Asher, and welcome to the show. I'm glad you could be here, and we're ramping up. We're actually on episode 99 at this point, and most likely you're listening to me on Spreaker Radio. You could be listening to me on iTunes, iHeart, SoundCloud, Spotify, and also the Paranormal UK radio station globally. So that's it's pretty keen for me. Little guy from Western Kentucky. It's kind of neat touching base with all these different folks, and I'm glad to have you here. We have a very special guest today, and I'm going to try to run through his bio and not butcher it too poorly. Rick Osmon was born in Indiana back in 1953. So that makes him older than spaceflight, FM radio, and also the color television. Now, in 1983, he earned an Associates of Science in Laser and Electro-Optics Technology. He worked high-tech lasers, night vision, and advanced optics for defense corporations and governments for about 25 years. He learned new things about the development of the LIDAR imaging, digital image analysis, and hyperspectrum analysis. Man, these are big words, and I'm a small man. All that time, he maintained an interest in ancient mysteries, as well as I did. A holdover from the hundreds of lithic artifacts found on his family farm, and a lifelong interest in local history. Now Rick is applying that learning in high-tech fields to try to solve some of those ancient mysteries. Now, Rick's currently research uses satellite imagery, LIDAR analysis, if I don't say this wrong, hydrology studies, magnetometers, and many other clues to find and identify ancient structures that are pretty much hidden to most traditional detection techniques. He also uses terrain analysis techniques to assess line-of-sight capability across the landscape features, either natural or artificial, that would enable long-distance communications using ancient materials and technologies. These results are compared to the analogous systems used in the Old World contemporaneously. Now, Rick writes a regular feature for Ancient American Magazine. Now, and it's titled Ancient Fortress of the Ohio Valley. In it, he has written about both accepted archaeology and counterculture traditions that have even gone to the point of historical cabals to hide certain history from the public. Now, his first book, The Graves of the Golden Bear, Ancient Fortresses, and Monuments of the Ohio Valley. It's now in its second edition. His next book, The Seer and the Oracle, will be available on Amazon, Kindle, Nook, and print later this year. So, everybody, I would like to welcome Rick Osmon to the show. How you doing, Rick?
I am well, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Oh, man, it was ham-fisted, but, that's what I get for not wearing my glasses out to the studio.
I have that same problem.
So
I understand that you have read at least most of the book.
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'm getting pretty deep into it. I'm right at the point where you're starting to touch on the giants, and so I'm just.
This is where the questions get heavy and big.
Yeah,
wait, that was a bad pun. But
no. There's no such thing as a bad pun. My kids are always getting on to me for my dad jokes, which I said, well, I guess they're granddad jokes because I'm a grandpop now. So whatever works. But yeah, man, that is so crazy because we talked some off air and before we started doing any of the interview stuff, and we kind of have that sort of similar history. You're a bump older than me, but the same sort of thing. Growing up, hearing the old wives' tales, knowing about a lot of the Indian mounds. We have obviously all through Kentucky, all through Ohio and Indiana. It's almost common. It's like finding clovers here. So,
it's hard to find a big area where there isn't something.
Honest to God, yeah. Like I said, I had worked for many years in the prison system, and it was one of that type of mentality of going out with a metal detector, and it's like, what's the point? You can't go 4 feet and not dig something up. So it's very much like that. It's so crazy because, like I said, I will ask you, have you been to around the what's the name of it? actually wrote about it. The Slack Farm area, where it has a lot of the Mesopotamian cultures, that what they call like Calhoun mound builders. It's
Well,
actually
I have not been to the Slack Farm itself. Of course, it's on the Kentucky side,
right.
but it is located at the conjunction of the Ohio and the Wabash River
Yeah,
for all intents and purposes. And on the other side of the Ohio River and on both sides of the Wabash, consequently, it is as thick there as it was at the Slack Farm. Now, what you don't hear about the Slack Farm, you hear that, okay, that's the one that started NAGPRA. That's the case that made everybody really upset about people digging up stuff.
Right. Yeah,
And
that was
rightfully
the
so.
well, sure, and like you said again, beyond the desecration aspects, beyond a lot of that, and as you know, through a lot of different people's journals, a lot of people's personal accounts and diaries and stuff, there's a lot of reports of things, big shaggy creatures and stuff, which, I mean, we can get kind of into that, and maybe that ties into something maybe that may have descended from the giant beings, creatures, or whatever. But let me ask you this: what did you think? What did you think when you first started seeing that? Because I would hear these stories as a boy, and you hear a lot of stuff as a kid. This is Western Kentucky, as I'm assuming, like a lot of small towns and things are. Everyone's got their like little ghost stories and those little things that grandma handed down and her grandma handed it to her. So it's sort of like just like family stories. Now you talked about your family's farm. Can you touch a little bit on that? And is that what kind of got you into this, or what really lit your fire to kind of do this?
Well, it served as my base camp. And it's kind of on a rise. I won't call it a hill because it's not. It's a fold in the land. It's closer to a sand dune than anything else except it's clay. And west of us, just a mile, it turns into sand and sand dunes for the next, 40 miles west. So we're in the lowlands. We're between a couple of forks of the White River, which is in itself an historic event just being here. And down there where you are, you're near some of the major rivers of both history and prehistory, because you got the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee all coming through your neighborhood and coming together right there at Paducah for all intents and purposes.
Right, and the thing too is once they did like the TVA and put up the Barkley Dam and all that, and basically took out towns. I mean, if anybody's seen like Brother Where Art Thou and stuff like that, where they flooded whole regions and just knocked down buildings and whatnot. But a lot of people forget, a lot of those buildings are still there. I can take you out in front of the penitentiary in Edible. When the river's low or the water's low, you can still see the old roads. When the sandbars are moving around and stuff, it's eerie. There's a lot of history there that people forget.
The occasional weather vane sticking up out of the water.
Exactly.
But the point being that the rivers were the highways forever. Wherever there were people, there were rivers. Wherever there were rivers, there were people for the most part. And they used those rivers not just for sustenance. Yes, they fished and caught water mammals and water birds and all this stuff. They used it for sustenance, but they also used it for transportation and somewhat for communications. So when you say communications, now you're implying something entirely different. Is it all face-to-face communications, or were they able to write something down? Or were they able to send a message across open space? And that's where I am today.
Well, let me ask you one thing. And because, like I said, we're going to kind of jump in between some of the stuff that I've read, and I want you to add to that, obviously. One of the things you were talking about was the map. Was it like 1718, I think?
It was published in 17. It wasn't published to the public. It was published to the King of France in 1718. He began compiling it as early as 1701. He got his first draft, we think, in 1716. It's by a guy by the name of Delisle, and he was the official geographer for the then to-be King of France, the heir to the throne, the Dauphin.
And it seems very much like you said. You were talking about like things have like big P's and small P's or whatever, to where it's like, well, this is sort of for king's eyes only. This wasn't for wide distribution, because they wanted to kind of keep that information secret. It's
right.
Like, okay, here's where the lead mines are, and here's this and that, and here are these people and things like that. And it's so strange, because reading this, I was like, well, that's really interesting. But then it really started getting into with interactions and things like that with local tribes. Now, what's one of the things that I noticed on it was talking about like ancient forts, and I'm talking, even ancient to the what would be called the and I'm doing air quotes, the natives. What was that about?
Yeah, and why did the map choose that specific usage of the French word ancien? It didn't mean the former place, that's one of the possible meanings. It meant this is truly ancient. This is before any living being was alive. That sense of ancient, and it's actually not very far from you.
Yeah,
it's in Cairo, Illinois.
It's so funny because I actually years and years ago, in between radio and starting to work in corrections, I used to drive office equipment of all things, right? Super sexy job too, man. It's a great job. So anyway, driving up and down, and I'd come down through Anna and come down through Cairo, and then cut across the Karnak Pass back to Metropolis, Illinois, and down all the way down to like Murray, Kentucky.
So you also went through Mound City.
Oh yeah, 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 right down there by Future City and all that. Yeah,
yeah, and you also went right past the National Battlefield site at the old hospital site where U.S. Grant took all these wounded or dying soldiers.
This is true,
and a lot of them are buried there. And the reason it is there is because it's at the conjunction of the Ohio and, well, in that case, the Tennessee. Yeah, because it's an important intersection.
Right. Well, and that's what, again, people think of, oh, we're going to go to Barkley Lake, which is a local thing or whatever. You're going to go, like you're talking about in Cairo, different places. Oh, well, we're going to go vacationing or we're going to go fishing or we're going to go. Right. But people, like you said, they lose that importance of this was food, this was communication, this was supplies, this was livelihoods. Community, exactly. I mean, it even goes back into religious practices of baptism. I mean, water is life. And for some people, water was eternal life, so water meant a lot. It still does. Just people have lost that connection with nature,
Well, you also have to consider the importance of being able to move not just goods, but also troops. So in that case, it's like the Autobahn of mid-20th century Germany. We didn't build it, but we used it that way.
Right, and I don't know how many people realize that, our interstate system was set up to move troops. It wasn't so you could, go see your Aunt Millie in Malibu. Right. It was, if something broke off, they could get troops down there in quick.
Right. And now you have all kinds of governmental agencies that are about, transportation and transportation safety and all this stuff. Yeah, that's not why we built those highways.
Right.
Yeah, we built those highways to be able to move tanks rapidly.
Right. Well, you know how it is. Ants at a party. Someone's going to co-opt something. But, that's kind of the nature of it. I mean, look at how many different places have been used by how many people.
Sure. All of them.
Right. Well, I mean, we can talk about, like the things about, like the old figurines and Prince Madoc, settling supposedly in Mobile Bay, however you want to pronounce it, in 1170. Well,
I feel it was much earlier than that. But, yeah, that's the tale that is told, that it was 1170. The evidence, when you trace it back, which I do in the book, and I'm not doing the original research here. I'm quoting other people. But it is 570 A.D. is when Madoc returned because he had already been to North America. He returned with colonists in 570. And he also returned with the king, which was his half-brother.
Well, something that is, and I said again, there's so much going on in the book, and it's a really great book. People need to check it out. You start talking about the Clarks, which were monumentally important in regards of, ladder discovery and especially pushing into Kentucky. I forgot who said the quote. Someone said, send back the Kentuckians and give us back the Indians. We'll deal with them.
The people of Vincennes, Indiana said that. No, actually, the parishioners of the Catholic Church in Vincennes said that.
Yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, they were militia. They weren't regular troops. They were militia there in 1807 to put down an uprising with the Kickapoo, which continued to brew for another 30 years. But Clark, that would be George Rogers Clark, took militia to Vincennes to help defend it. And then he went up the river, the Wabash, to try to chase down these Kickapoo. the tribe that had been there for 3,000 or 4,000 years probably, and knew every rock, and he was unable to catch them. And
Now,
the troops
mhm.
that were with him knew that the Kickapoo were badass, and they didn't really want to catch them. So he had desertions of about 50% overnight.
What's so crazy? When I was a kid, I don't know if you remember that. Well, God, of course you do. You're a bump older than me. But they used to have a drink called Kickapoo Joy Juice. Do you remember this?
Yes. And
Okay.
it was an outgrowth. It was actually paid. It paid trademark rights to Al Cap for its appearance as a label, a brand, because he had come up with it in his Dog Patch Sunday cartoon, Little Abner.
Right. Now, is that the guy that also did like the fries, like the Andy Cap fries? Is that the same?
No. Andy Cap. Andy Cap is actually an English character. Al Cap is an American. Well, his real name was Alan Kaplan. He was a New York Jew who assumed the name Cap to have more readership.
Right. To kind of blend in, as it were, back in that time.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask them. There was one of the Clarks, and I jotted this down because I knew I'd forget it. And basically, he said he had got an Indian to show him the place where their gods are. Says about which all the neighboring nations made such a fuss, into which the Mobilians, I believe, used to come and offer sacrifices. The Indians claimed that a person cannot touch them without dying on the spot, and that they came down from the sky. Now, these things that they visited, were they thinking they were some sort of alien artifacts, or kind of like an ark? Could that been maybe where the ark ended up?
No, I don't know what it is. There's no adequate description to tell us what it is. Now, as to the person who discovered it, quote unquote, discovered it, he was d'Iberville. He was the brother or half brother of the governor of La Louisiana, the French governor of Louisiana at the time. That was in 1701, I think.
Yeah. Well, and that's something that a lot of people fail to think of. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It's just most people think, okay, Kentucky, but basically think Kentucky, Tennessee also is the same thing. But they're thinking it's like hee-haw, NASCAR, cornfields, low education, and just, whatever. It's just sort of a flyover state. Coal mines, definitely coal mines, and at one time a big tobacco region. Now it's soybean land. Yeah. But which actually
there are other resources right in your area, and I'm talking you can throw a stone at them, that are incredibly valuable for world trade and have been for a very long time. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the d'Iberville thing, going back to these statues.
Yes.
He implied, without saying so, that they were all ceramic, and that each of them had a resemblance, a likeness to something in the real world. There was
like an owl.
There was an owl. There was a bear, a man, a woman, and a child. Those were the five things. And the bear, as you might guess, had something to do with the title of the book, The Graves of the Golden Bear.
Right.
And that is one of the quote unquote titles or nicknames, if you will, for King Arthur II of Wales. So now the Mobian Indians, their description, something landed, but it's on an island in Mobile Bay. Something came to land there. They may have meant a boat, but their words were not translated at it. You see, it may not have been a skycraft. It may have been a watercraft. But
which they would have had word for a water vessel, right? Or like a giant canoe or something like that. I mean, it's not like they were...
Right.
Because, early people had more technology than they talk about.
Well, yeah, when you talk about a canoe, a birch bark canoe is an oddity. The dugout canoe is the usual. And they were 30, 40 feet long and 5 feet wide. They carried cargo. There's one. There's the wreck of one. There's no wood left, but the contents came to rest inside the boat on the bottom of the ocean off the coast of Wales. And it's 41 feet long, 5.5 feet wide, and it had almost 10 tons of cargo on it. And it was copper and tin, a little bit of gold, some bronze. There was almost no alloyed metal, but there was a lot of spun ingots of both tin and copper to make bronze. And there was no copper in England to speak of. And yet there was almost 8.5 tons of it in this boat. Now think about that. That the water had to be up to the gunnels on this thing.
Yeah. Well, and that shows they have a sort of a line of sight, meaning contemporary science and dogmatic historians, to go, no, if we don't say it's happened, hasn't happened. So, you always heard those stories, and then I can confirm it, and it gets a little conspiracy theory, but hey, let's do it. It's fun. Talking about, well, they found, like, again, talked about, like, the things like the Solar plate and things like that, and different things, giants and different, tools and things that should not have been in certain layers of earth and strata, but at that period, right. And then it says, well, they don't talk about it.
Right. They call it a problematic. Whether it's an artifact or a situation, it's a problematic that they can't explain. Yeah. So they ignore it.
It's problematic for them. It's not problematic for history. I mean, that's the thing.
Correct.
Good or bad, be it if, because, I know people that are like First Nation people, and I know people that are different, indigenous people in Texas and things. And I'm like, if they were to show that maybe there was early, settlers, be it white or whatever, African, whatever, would you have a problem with it? And the ones that are not historians are connected to any sort of academia go, history is history. Doesn't matter if I like it or not.
It is what it is.
And everyone's been co-opted by somebody at some time or another. Someone's been subjugated and then fought back or whatever. Somebody subjugated somebody else. And I think it's extremely interesting. There was a thing I want to talk to about talking about about Chief Tobacco in a minute, but explain a little bit more about Massacre Island, which is such a cool name for a metal band. If I started a metal band, it would be called Massacre Island.
Yeah, I understand completely. In fact, I even considered that. But Massacre Island was once named Dauphine Island. It became known as Dauphine Island, but originally it was called Massacre Island because it was covered in human bones, and we're talking
a lot deep. Like
we think
stacks.
We're talking chest deep on a 10-acre island. So it's Jesus a lot.
Christ.
It's a lot of dead people, and because of hurricanes and various things, the bone layer is gone. It's undetectable. I'm sure it's not completely gone. It's just not detectable. Plus, it's in salt water. It's going to decay pretty fast.
Right.
It's actually in brine. Mobile Bay is kind of briny rather than saline, but it's an interesting occurrence, and it's not the only occurrence of massive piles of bones, human bones specifically, gathered together and discovered in historical context, but being of this prehistorical origin. There was another cave not very far from you, incidentally, in which it was kind of like a sinkhole cave. Not that they have a lot of those in your area, but you can't go 10 feet without seeing one.
Exactly.
And it's done like a cenote is in the Yucatan. They don't go down in it. They throw stuff in it, including bodies. And when this was reported in 1797 or whatever it was by Rafinesque, the bodies on top were pretty fresh. The ones at the bottom were already turning to dust, meaning they were at least thousands of years old. And you could look down in this thing and see other stuff. You could see artifacts thrown in there as probably as offerings or whatever. Mm-hmm. So it was definitely intentional. It wasn't they all washed in there at once.
Well, now, what's your conjecture on it? Do you feel that this was just another warring tribe? Do you think this was? When you say standard 5 foot, 6 foot tall humans. We're not talking about giants or anything like that. Correct.
Well, none of the reports mention giant bones in this. I still want to call it a cenote. Okay. But before we go too far onto that one, there are other occurrences, and one of them is actually very important, and it was called Sand Island. It was in the middle of the Ohio River, right below what is today Louisville, Kentucky, right out in front of Clarksville, Indiana. and it too was waist deep in human bones, and it was a 3.5 acre island. And the natives, Cornstalk and Chief Tobacco, both those guys, and they came from different directions. One came from north, one came from south, by 100 miles or so from the river. Both of them told the same tale to George Rogers Clark, I might add. One of them told the tale.
Well, I actually
Cornstalk.
had. Well, sorry, I actually had your quote here. If you wanted me to read it real quickly.
Yeah, great.
Sorry. George Rogers Clark recorded in his memoirs that and I will mispronounce the tribe, Piscanscus, help me with it, Piankashaw chief named Tobacco was surprised to see him with red hair and blue eyes and white skin. The Indian chief had remarked to Clark that he thought his people had killed off all of his people, thinking, I guess he was coming from that tribe. He was a survivor somehow with retaliatory troops, I guess. That's heavy. I mean, but then that's another thing I was going to talk to you about before we jump back on it, was the tie-in with Mormonism. Okay, because there was a group called like Nephites and Lephites in Mormon faith, and they were supposedly people who traveled from, I guess, the original Jews, or what do you want to call the original Jews? Which some people say they
Middle
were.
East, let's just go with Middle Eastern.
Middle Eastern.
Right.
There you go, from that region, and they believe that they left from there and settled in the Americas. And of course, everyone's like, that's friggin' crazy. And then you even had guys like Casey talking about early precursors to Native Americans. And now people are starting to, like you said, uncover, the bones with the ochre smears and the giants and the red-haired bodies and things like that.
And artifacts.
And artifacts that should not have been like the advanced tools that they had at the time. I'm not talking about power drills or nothing, but were not indicative at the time in the people. It was like they were sort of out of time or out of place.
Yeah, or engraved tablets, stone tablets with Hebrew writing on them, that kind of thing. Those things are just decried as hoaxes as soon as they're discovered.
Well, of course. I mean, do you remember of course you do. The gentleman did the forward in your book talking about the hooked X and all that. Love that, and it's got nothing to do. To me, it has nothing to do with race. To me, it has nothing to do with subjugation. It's just like it's history. If they come back and said everybody come from, I don't know, everybody come from Italy or everybody come from the Antarctic regions or something like that. Okay, there it is.
That's my first choice, by the way. No, actually,
okay.
But if you get all the way through the book, and this is kind of a spoiler for those who have not read it, you will find in a couple of or three places in there where I say it would have been much easier and much better evidence that the Native Americans were taking their technologies and resources to the rest of the world before the rest of the world was coming here. And I can show a few examples of that, thanks to people like Gunnar Thompson and Carl Johannesson, who have cataloged not just the plants, but even the manufactured goods that are in the old world archaeological record that should not be there. They are out of place artifacts and or resources. Carl Johannesson has identified and explained why 437 species should not be here or there without ancient sea travel. Not just ancient travel, very specifically ancient sea travel. So those things could not have happened by his logic, and it's very sound logic, without the ancient peoples, whoever they were, whatever color they were, it doesn't matter to me. They were smart. They were cosmopolitan. They were innovative. And they were, they were very actively cruising the entire planet, maybe to include Antarctica. And you also go back, and today we have all this global warming stuff. And where the glaciers have melted, say in Norway or parts of Canada or Alaska, the archaeologists are rushing out there to find the artifacts that are revealed once a glacier has melted. Hold on a second.
Sure.
Does that mean that the glacier is younger than the human occupation of Alaska?
Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yes, it does.
Right. Well, what do you take from the thing? Again, I'm so bad with names. I apologize. Walam Olam. There was a
Yeah,
written history,
yeah.
recorded history of the Delaware Indians, where it said the history describes a mysterious race called the Talagari, or am I saying that wrong?
Uh-huh. Yeah, no, you got it right. Uh, we think that's how it's pronounced. Nobody
Okay.
knows. Nobody. It's
Well,
not a living language. But yeah,
yeah.
good
So I say,
try.
if there's any Talagari out there, please email me and let me know.
Yeah,
But
yeah. Let me know too.
well, yeah,
The
that'd be
term
another book.
Delaware is also a misnomer. The tribe did not call themselves Delaware. They did not necessarily call themselves Lenni Lenape, but that's probably the closest we'll get to being accurate right today. They recorded a migration, if you will, of their entire people, not just a tribe or a clan, but their entire race from the east to the west. And it's on birch bark. Um, it's I would have to call it a ideographic rendition of their migration history. And it's open to some interpretation. Again, this is going back to Rafinesque. This is a guy who had no credentials of any kind for anything. But he wrote it all down. He wrote down what he heard or was sent. He's the only one who did. So he's the guy for that period of time. There was no archaeology in the 1790s, early 1800s, up till about 1860. The term wasn't even used.
Right. I'm going to remind everybody that they are listening to the House of Asher, and we were speaking with Rick Osmon about the graves of the Golden Bear, fortresses, and monuments of the Ohio Valley, touching on some really, really cool stuff. And what's so crazy is that you hear so much, you hear so much about different little things, and then, like you said, you take any step, and go here. This is written stuff in their own words from their own tribes. And then people, it's funny. They kind of, sometimes I feel academia treats the tribes hot and cold. It's like, oh no, they were landed here. They were, you know, wise and wonderful. And they'll go, well, I mean, it's just stories. It's just allegories. I said, okay, well, which is it? Are they remarkable people? Or are they just simple people making stick figures over on the wall? You got to make your mind up. And, that's where it sort of plays. They kind of play it to keep the sand under your feet not solid, but the tall white strangers with and moon-eyed people.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
But
that's telling.
But here's where it gets really interesting. That may be two different bunches of people: tall white strangers and then the moon-eyed people. Two different bunches of people. Now, you started this off asking about the slack farm.
I did.
Okay, I'm going to bring it back to that for just a moment. The slack farm became controversial because guys were out there, several guys, many guys, were out there with backhoes digging up graves. And they parked that backhoe in one area, and they just started going down a line digging up these graves.
And everything, not just artifacts, bones and everything.
Yeah. Well, but here is the most significant and most overlooked part of that statement. Those graves were all in a line. It was laid out like a cemetery. 4,800 of them laid out in lines and rows like a cemetery. Worse, they knew where to go because each of those graves had a marker with writing on it.
That's uncommon for.
Yeah. And most of them, if we had the specimen, and we could run DNA and or carbon-14 on it, which we can't under natural law. We can't do that. Then we would be able to determine, A, when they were alive and or buried, and B, where they came from, who they were, what their ethnology was. Were they mixed? Were they, very concentrated, homogeneous population? There are so many things we could learn, but we never will because of NAGPRA. The other thing is, it wasn't just at the slack farm. As I mentioned earlier, it was also in Illinois and Indiana. The Covey Lake, the Bone Bank. There are 7 or maybe 8 separate communities of that density in that region of 80 square miles, give or take?
Yeah, I'd say that's right. Well, let me ask you this real quick before we jump too deep into that. obviously you've been here in my little town of Princeton, Kentucky, and in the surrounding areas. You've been to Land Between the Lakes, or we call it LBL, which is very close to like Eddyville, Draftonville, Lake City, all that. Have you heard anything connected with that in regards of, early stories of, the early people, indigenous people, or encounters with different types of travelers and different sort of just odd stories like that? Because, especially if you have, next time you're in, we need to take a trip.
Well, we need to take a trip anyway. But yeah, I'll tell you one little story that I find completely fascinating, partly because Eddyville and Princeton were the Trail of Tears. That's where, after 1830, Indian Removal Act went into effect, and the Army and everybody else, all the whites, and even some Indians said, okay, we're moving to the other side of the Mississippi, and those of you who don't come willingly are going to go unwillingly. And that's what happened. Anyway, that Trail of Tears came to you, where you are right now. At the other, another part of the Cumberland Valley, at least, down there by Mentone, Alabama, there's a place called DeSoto Falls. Now, in between DeSoto Falls and the top of, what's that big mountain down there? Oh yeah, Lookout Mountain. Most people don't realize Lookout Mountain's almost 100 miles across. One mountain.
Yeah, it's worth the visit.
Yeah, it's worth the visit. But the Cherokee who lived on Lookout Mountain were holdouts, and they did not want to leave under the Indian Removal Act. So the Army was mustered to force them to remove. And while they were after this one particular small village of almost all women and children, young children, the soldiers told the tale that they were attacked by a large number of very, very small people. We're talking 3 foot tall people. And they would rush up through this dense underbrush and tie a string around the soldier's leg and set the string on fire somehow. None of the soldiers could elaborate on how, but they were very adamant that the little people were helping this band of Cherokee. The Cherokee were adamant that the little people were helping this band of Cherokee. So,
okay. So
what's real here? Were there really little people?
Well, I mean, a lot of tribes report almost like picked or pygmy type creatures that are, that kind of almost lived sort of in a union with them. They help them out, they help each other out. Which, I mean, you hear, it's so funny because, we talk about giants and you talk about little people or wee people or whatever you want to call it. Yeah, that's strange. Light and strings, they just I don't know. I don't know what they're doing there.
I don't either. And wherever you go, whatever tribe you talk to, at least all of them I've talked to on this continent, they have their own tales of the little people. Sometimes they're tricksters. Sometimes they're, benefactors. Sometimes they're malevolent. Sometimes they bring great magic. Sometimes they cause great pain or even disaster, particularly if you cross it.
Sure. Well, I mean, and we're not that far removed from that. I mean, if I'm saying something about, well, I just got the car fixed, I shouldn't have any more. Let me knock on wood. Hopefully won't be any more problems with it. I mean,
right.
We do that every day, and that's goes back to ancient, Scottish and Irish Isles and stuff. It's it just carries back. And the further,
oh, it's not just there. You go to the Middle East as an example, and this is one that I brought out. I didn't emphasize it enough. The Arab word for the little devils is one of the best translation. Is the jinn, the genies, if you will. The genies, they kept in a bottle. That's how small they are.
Right, like the Islamic jinns.
That's exactly who I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Now, the Native American word, and it doesn't really matter which language group you're talking about, is Pakwajini. Jini is the last part of that name, that word. So the jinn or Jini in Arabic or Islamic countries, depending on which part of the region you're in, it's the same word for a very, very, very similar physical description and behavioral description. Little bastards.
Well, and that's the thing. Everything carries over. Words we use every day. I mean, you know this, and I'm sure a lot of people know it. Maybe they don't. But you talk about assassins come from Hassins, and
Hashashin, yeah.
Hashashins, and these guys were trained, and they were really bumped up on some potent drugs, so they didn't feel anything. They would go kill on demand. So I mean, everything is a hangover or whatever from a previous culture. Before we get off into talking about some of these really strange artifacts, like some of the Spanish gold and things like that, and Roman coins that were found in different locations, have you ever heard of something called the mud flood theory?
The mud flood theory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm aware of it. Yeah.
Okay. I was kind of curious what you thought about it. It's new to me, and when I heard about it, I was kind of like, what? I don't know. And then I started seeing a lot of pictures and stuff, and I was like, well, I mean, you're seeing buildings half buried in the earth, like full windows that are underground. Doesn't make sense. There's no recorded flood or disaster in that area, like the St. Petersburg Cathedral and things like that. And, the basic...
Texas.
Yeah, there you go. And, a lot of people said the Great Dust Bowl was not so much a cause due to crop rotation. It was because of so much of the topsoil that was taken away from the, whatever it was, 1700s mud flood. And I wondered, what else could we have found? Like you said, we found a lot of different stuff, but people go, well, there's no evidence of this and that. Maybe it got washed off into that. Maybe it got all pushed off in the ocean. Who knows? I was just kind of curious what your speculation on that was.
Okay, well, there's a whole speculation. I can do all kinds of speculation, but I like to go examine what the scientific community does first. Then I can form a speculation that might actually have some validity. One of my favorite examples of a mud flood event that is historical and can be verified is the old steamboat that was lost in the Missouri River in, what was it, 1872 or 3? And we just found it here again about, 12 years ago? And they dug it up and they found all the goods still in this boat. And they also found evidence, good or bad evidence, that the boat had been scuttled rather than lost. So, that's a mud flood event. This thing was under, 48 feet of mud. This ship from 130 years ago was under 48 feet of mud. Now, that's a mud flood.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you looked at the different, and I don't mean to go too far off on a tangent with that, but like all the the Seattle Underground stuff, and just there's so many different places, and because like I said, it was like, okay, there's one thing, maybe something happened, maybe the ground settled, but a lot of the places did not have, like, if something happened. If you find 4 or 5 buildings in the ground in western Kentucky, it's probably because we're sitting on a honeycomb of mines and karst systems. But certain places like Seattle and other places that maybe don't have that wide underground cave systems, it's harder to explain, especially like the Midwest.
Or any limestone at all.
Exactly. Exactly. And yeah, so it's really curious, especially when they start talking about, if you talk to different people and you read different people's works, and especially guys like Casey and whatnot, you can tell I'm a fan of Casey. But then it talks about, like, the rediscovering of things. There's nothing new under the sun, as the old adage goes. And people are just rediscovering their history. But it seems we're at a point now, the majority of people are so adamant about keeping their head in the sand about anything. And I'm not a truther, I'm not a this and that, I'm just like a guy that likes doing research. But man, if there was a lot of compelling evidence, why are you doing that? What are you scared of? What's going to happen? Is it going to hurt your ego or something if you hear that someone was here before you? Are we that fragile?
We as individuals are not, but our society is. And I'd make that distinction with some surety and a whole lot of 60 years of consideration. And I'll go back because I know we're running out here. While we got 15 minutes, maybe. Yeah,
about 10 and some change.
The idea of manifest destiny in the United States, and it's not a unique to the United States problem, but here's one of the best examples of it. We'll go back to England in a minute. In the United States, in the 1830s, 40s, and into the 60s even, we had this thing called manifest destiny. It is God's will that these guys here in Washington, D.C., take ownership of, this whole continent. You other people, just get the hell out of the way because we're going to do this.
Divine providence.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they ran with it. And they ran with it as a nation. Now, there were individuals amongst the nation who did not feel the same way. Some of them were not actually citizens of the United States, even though they owned the land long before the United States existed. And here, of course, I'm talking about the natives. And then you had this other group of people who were brought here under force. And then suddenly, in 1865, they were released, but they still didn't have any rights or privileges. So this manifest destiny was pretty much to this group of people inside this domed building in Washington, D.C. That's who ran everything, or thought they did. And then when the scientists, particularly a guy by the name of Squire or Moorhead or these other people that came up with evidence, Schoolcraft was my favorite, said, oh, look, there's writing on this. No, there's not. That's not writing. That's chicken scratches. And here, I wrote that down long ago. If you find it as chicken scratches, it doesn't mean a thing. And that voice was John Wesley Powell, Major John Wesley Powell, who was evacuated to the hospital, by the way, there at Cairo from Shiloh. So you have these cookie cutter heroes who are handed, virtual greatness if they will do one little thing for the government itself. Not even for the people. Play ball. Yeah. Tell it our way or no way. So the whole idea that these people that came before us or were here before us, whether they came or they just started here, humanity could have started here rather than Africa, as far as I'm concerned. Anyway,
sure.
The idea that science would recognize that these people were sophisticated, urbane, smart, they had communication skills, they had sciences, some of which we don't yet understand, but they had them. And that's not good for a government who based its existence on its own lies. And I'm not talking about the U.S. government here. I'm talking about world government.
Right.
The French, the English, the Spanish, the Russians, the Swedes, they all knew that these people were smart, whoever they were, red, white, green, I don't care. They were smart. And that was not good for the people who were trying to take over. And in England, because I said I'd come back to that, the English, the Angles, they took over the British Isles from the Brits and then tried to erase that history. The Brits had wonderful history, including Prince Madoc and King Arthur. But now, oh no, those are just legends. They don't mean anything on either continent or island in that case. Because if it were actually true, then the current governments would not be considered completely legitimate.
Right. You have to kill the heirs and kill the line. There's, that's global. Everybody, and the victors make the history, right?
Right. And that goes back to Rome. Rome wrote its own histories. Nobody else got to write any histories about Rome because they ceased to exist under Rome. Carthage being a primary example. We hear about Carthage. We don't hear the Carthage side. We don't hear their story. We only hear the Roman side of that story. Except for a guy by the name of Polybius, who was a Greek by birth and a hostage in Rome for 17 years at the time that Scipio Africanus went to Carthage and took it down, and Polybius was the only eyewitness to write a history of it. He was still a little bit prejudiced because, well, he was still a prisoner to Rome.
Right. Well, let me ask you this in the last little bit we've got, and I definitely want to, if I haven't ran you off of this interview, have you back on, because like I said, an hour it's an appetizer. You're like a 20-course meal, so we could definitely do a lot of shows if you want to. The Roman coins, and I believe there was a sword that was found along the Ohio River, which I think there was breastplates and some other artifacts too, I believe.
Yes.
What went down there?
Well, okay. The tendency, as you just did, is to lump them all together as a single event. And I contend that they represent at least 3 different events over 3 different periods of time. The Roman coins, obviously, were Roman coins, and they had dates, and they're from the 2nd to 4th century. There were 52 of them in a collection. 2 of them actually made it to a little museum on the Falls of the Ohio called, the Falls of the Ohio Museum. And that's that display, display, that's the right word, stood in that museum for over a decade. And then the state of Indiana took over the museum, and that display went away because it represented something that could not be true. The Romans were never here, period. It's ipsy dixit, because I say so. And the sword, which I did a lot of digging on this one. That sword is a theatrical reproduction from the 1870s or 80s, someplace in there. That one, I'd love for it to be real, but it's not. The armor, the breastplate, and there was also a helmet and a couple other things, probably a gauntlet, and it came up with bodies, according to the tale. There were actually 2 events. One was from 1780s and 1770s, actually, and the other one was from 1936. The 1936 one was ancient armor, but I don't know that it was there as a legitimate, loss, or whether it was placed as a hoax. The 1780s incident involves 6 different bodies, 6 different breastplates, all with the same ancient Welsh crest on them. So we have a pretty good idea that they were ancient Welsh.
Which there was also a discussion, just jumping off onto that. I'm sorry, I have radio ADHD. You had mentioned there was a tribe that spoke Welsh, right?
Well, that was the tale, and there were many tales of Welsh-speaking Indians, but the one that was chased down specifically on the orders of Thomas Jefferson to William Clark and Meriwether Lewis, incidentally, was the Mandan out there on the upper Missouri River. And they had blonde hair, blue eyes, green eyes, red hair, very fair according to all the witnesses who went there. George Catlin went there in the 1830s, and they had already been reduced to almost nothing because of disease, possibly introduced by, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis and the other 30-odd members of the Corps of Discovery.
Right.
But that Corps of Discovery wintered over in a Mandan village. They liked them well enough, they stayed the entire winter with them. They built a fort within their own village, so they were kind of separate, but they weren't.
Okay, well, now, well, go ahead.
And at the end of that stay, when they were moving on further west, Meriwether Lewis entered into his journal, in the pages that are not missing. When I started on this venture, started planning this venture some 10 years ago, it's like, what? Wait, you just bought that land last year. How the hell did that happen? So the powers that be were planning to spread the United States across the continent 10 years before they actually started doing it.
Wow. Well, let me ask you this in the last few minutes, and that's if you can kind of encapsulate this in like a quick little bit. Like the Cornish tin, Spanish gold, was this sort of in the same time frame, respectively, as this, or was this later in different areas? Where were some of these located at?
Okay, Cornish tin comes from Cornwall in the British Isles, and it has done so for 7,000 or 8,000 years, we think. The copper to make the bronze that the tin went into came from Upper Michigan, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago, as a start. Can I prove that? Not to the satisfaction of academia. Can I prove it to your satisfaction? You bet. Yeah, I can do that. Now, the Spanish gold came from all over, including Spain. There was one gold mine in Spain. I know we got like 2 minutes left, and it was not started by Spanish. It was started by Carthaginians, and they mined it for probably 150, 200 years, according to the archaeological evidence. Then Carthage was destroyed by Rome, and this thing laid fallow for 200 years. And in about the first century, late in the first century BC, Rome started reopening this mine and started mining it again. And after the fall of Rome, it went fallow again, and it stayed fallow until the early 19th century when a British company started reopening the mine, and they went searching for the mine based on the histories of Polybius and other Roman histories. So history can have its value, like opening a gold mine. If that's the Spanish gold you're talking about, great. If not, then we'll come back and address that.
Well, and that's the thing. We literally could talk hours and hours on this. And I do want to remind people again, we are speaking with Rick Osmon, and the book is Graves of the Golden Bear, Fortresses and Monuments of the Ohio Valley. And again, what was the name of the new book things that you got coming up? And also mention any appearances that you got coming up.
Sure. The Seer and the Oracle I hope to have out by later this year, and it will be mostly electronic format because it's got a lot of color images, and you just can't print those. I can't afford to. Let's see, appearances. I'll be at the Ancient Artifact Preservation Society meeting the first weekend in October in Harris, Michigan. This May 18th, I'll be at Tazewell, Indiana, performing musically. That's the other thing I do. For the Make-A-Wish Foundation benefit at White Oaks Cabins in Tazewell, Indiana.
That's awesome, by the way.
That's an all-day thing. There's like 15 acts. Me and my buddy are just one of them.
Man, that's, as a person who has some special needs kids, that, if you've ever, obviously you've played in front of these kids, you see how their eyes lights up. That's where my heart's at. That's sort of my thing. I work with special needs adults, but my interest is in this. It's sort of that weird Jekyll and Hyde thing. But it's wonderful that people like you do what you do and still, have time to give back and care enough to take care of little guys. Also, I was going to say, when and if you can get back down in here in Princeton, I'll, treat you to some Heaton's barbecue or something if you want to. Okay,
that's a deal. I've heard great things about that barbecue. So.
Oh, the burgers are killer too.
Okay.
Maybe I can get them as a commercial on here. But
there you go.
Well, let me ask you this. We were talking about Slack Farm. Would you like to come down and check out Slack Farm sometime?
I would like that. I would like that very, very much.
Okay, and I can put you in touch with some people that's had. They're basically almost like Bigfoot or Dogman sightings. I don't know if you entertain that a whole lot, but it's still interesting stuff.
I entertain it. I've never had my own sighting. I have had experiences. I've never had a sighting.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard a lot of wood knocks and kind of whoops, I guess you'd call them. Which we're country boys. We know the difference between a wildcat or whatever, or a deer grunting or something like that, which we don't really have. Well, let me change that. We don't necessarily have black bears here. They're starting to kind of come up from Tennessee due to all the fires migrating a little bit, but we don't have any here yet. And hopefully that's going to stay that way.
You can tell the difference between their smell and the Bigfoot smell. There is a difference, and they're both strong. So there you go.
Okay. If I smell anything strong in the woods, I'm moving. I'll deal with ghosts. I'll deal with hauntings. I'll deal with some stuff like that. I love reading about cryptids. I don't want any part of them. Maybe I'm a chicken. That's okay.
Oh, we'll do a show about cryptids because you're near one of the best areas in the world for that.
Man, I'm telling you, that's what it's about. Well, listen, Rick Osmon, thank you so much. If you want, I'm going to do this outro, and I'll be right back with you shortly thereafter.
Sure.
Thanks for being on, sir.
My pleasure.
And there it is, folks. Man, I'm so lucky that people want to come on and talk about these interesting subjects, especially stuff that kind of overlaps where I live, because not many people know this little section of Kentucky. And I welcome anybody, nationally, globally, come on down. We'll leave the light on for you. Maybe I don't need to use that one. I'll get sued. But I want you to go out and enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy that beautiful sunshine. But as the sun goes down and the shadows grow long, make sure to check out your back door, under your bed, and out the back hallway. You never know. You might have a little pick running around out there. Who knows what's going to be out there. But love each other. Love yourselves. And as always, take care, everybody. Until next time. Take care.